All right, imaginary numbers is going to round out the quadratic stuff that we're looking at. All right, so imaginary numbers, we use an I for. Okay, they're not something that you can see on your graph, but sometimes your solutions can have imaginary solutions. We're not going to get really deep into it, but you need to know that I squared equals -1. That's where our imaginary numbers come from. So then if I want to get I by itself, I can square root, and that means that I equals the square root of -1. So now, anytime you have a negative under a radical, normally we would say no solution because you can't have a negative because nothing squared gives you a negative number. But that's where our imaginary numbers come in. So if I have a negative under here, I can treat this as the square root of -1 times the square root of 4. Right? So the square root of -1 is I, the square root of 4 is 2, so that means that the square root of -4 is, plus or minus 2i. All right, the square root of -12 I can think of as the square root of -1 times the square root of 12. All right, 12 is not a perfect square, but we can break it down. So that's 2 and 6, and then 2 and 3. Okay, so the square root of -1 becomes I. Okay, and then the square root of 12 becomes plus or minus 2 root 3. So then the square root of -12 simplifies to plus or minus 2i root 3. Basically, you simplify like normal, but if there's a negative in there, you're going to put an I on the outside. That's really the only thing that changes. Okay, so I have two examples we're going to do. We're going to solve quadratics like we did the last two videos. We're going to do one quadratic formula, one complete and square, but these are going to have negatives under our square roots. All right, so just like before, for quadratic formula, I need it set equal to 0. So I'm going to start by adding 5 to both sides and moving it over. Then I've got to pick my A, B, and C. So I'm going to write them off to the side here. Oops, let me make you see, save some room. So my A is 8, my B is 6, and my C is 5. All right, then I'm going to plug in. So I got -b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. My B is 6, my A is 8, and my C is 5. All right, so -6 is just -6 plus or minus square root. 6 squared is 36. 4 times 8 is 40. 4 times 8 is 32. 32 times 5 is going to be 160. All right, and then I have one minus sign in there, so I have a negative. And then 2 times 8 is 16. All right, 36 minus 160 is -124. So we get -6 plus or minus square root of -124 over 16. So before this, we could have stopped and said this was no solution. But now we know what to do. So I'm going to come off to the side, save some room. Okay, so I'm going to come up here, and we're going to simplify that square root of -124. Okay, because it's a negative, I'm going to just put an I on the outside. And then I'm going to break down 124 like we've been doing. So I know it's even, so I'm going to say 2, and then half of 124 is 62. Right? Then I have 2 and 31, and then 31's prime. I have two 2's. For everything you circle, take one out. So I'm going to have a 2 on the outside, my 31 left on the inside, and then an I, which I didn't leave room for. We always put the I last. All right, so then that means this simplifies to -6 plus or minus 2i root 31 over 16. And we are so close. All right, we did simplify our radical, so I can't break it apart and get down to numbers, but we can simplify one more time. If you look at your 3 numbers here, there's something that goes into all 3 of them, and that's 2. So I can simplify my fractions just like I would simplify 4 over 6 to 2/3. I can simplify these fractions by dividing them all by 2. So when we do that, I'm going to get a -3 plus or minus I, just one I, root 31 over 8. That's my simplest form. All right, number 2, completing the square. For completing the square, we want to get our constant on the other side, and our x is on the one side. So I'm going to do x squared minus 6x equals, I'm going to subtract that 10 over. 0 minus 10 is negative 10. And then I got to put the box in, just like we did before. To figure out what goes in the box, we take half of b and we square it. So half of my b is negative 3, squared is 9. All right, and then that's going to let us write it in parentheses. Okay, so my parentheses, I just take half of b, so that's a minus 3. Negative 10 plus 9 is a negative 1. To solve, I can square root both sides. So I get x minus 3 equals, and we already talked about this one, the square root of negative 1 is just I. So I'm going to say plus or minus I. And then I have to add 3 to both sides. Remember, put the 3 first, plus or minus I, and that's as far as I can go. Can't break that down anymore, and I can't combine anything with I, so I just leave it just like that. So if you have a negative under your radical, don't freak out. Just put an I on the outside and then simplify like normal.